How a millionaire's daughter chose to love a poor houseboy over luxury. On a fancy street called Hillcrest Avenue sits a big, beautiful house. The mansion looks rich, with shiny marble floors and perfectly trimmed gardens. Inside this house works David Chen, a 23-year-old man who knows how to work hard and how to pray. David went to college and got a business degree, but tough times in his life forced him to take a job as a houseboy for the wealthy Williams family. Instead of working in an office with his business diploma, he now cleans, serves, and does whatever the family asks of him. His life hasn't turned out the way he planned, but David doesn't give up. He brings his same strong work ethic and faith to this job, just like he would to any other work. Every day, he does his tasks carefully and keeps hope alive in his heart. Every morning, before the sun breaks through the mist, David kneels in the garden shed he calls home. His whispered prayers float among the roses he tends, asking not for wealth or escape, but for strength to face another day with dignity. His small living space holds 3 treasures: a worn Bible, a notebook filled with business ideas, and a photo of his late parents, who taught him that true wealth lies in character. Sarah Williams, the family's 21-year-old daughter, fresh from graduating with honors in social work, often watches from her window, not with the condescension her parents display, but with growing curiosity. She notices things others miss, how David slips portions of his lunch to the stray cats that roam the estate, how he helps Mrs. Peterson next door with her groceries when he thinks no one is watching, how he teaches the gardener's children to read during his breaks. But the Williams household holds its hierarchies sacred. Mr. Williams, a real estate mogul, treats David like a mere extension of his property. Mrs. Williams, draped in designer brands, can't remember David's name, calling him boy despite his education and age. Yet David maintains his composure, responding to each command with quiet dignity that speaks louder than any protest. Sarah's awakening begins on a rainy morning. While her parents sleep in their lavish wing of the mansion, she stumbles upon a scene that shifts something deep within her. Under the heavy downpour, David kneels, fashioning a makeshift shelter for 3 helpless kittens abandoned in the storm. He cradles them gently, shielding them from the cold, his expression one of pure compassion. Their eyes meet, his filled with unspoken kindness, hers questioning everything she has ever been taught about class and worth. In that moment, something stirs. A quiet revolution begins, not with grand declarations or defiant protests, but with a simple act of kindness, a fleeting glance that dares to see beyond the rigid barriers of wealth and status. The seeds of change are often sown in the most unexpected places, and in the perfectly ordered world of the Williams estate, those seeds had just begun to take root. Sometimes, the most profound transformations start not with words, but with the simple act of truly seeing another person, not for their status, not for their circumstances, but for who they truly are. The Williams mansion cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun as Sarah watched her mother's Mercedes pull into the circular driveway. Through the bay window of the study, she observed David rushing to open the car door, his movements careful despite his exhaustion. He'd been fighting a fever all day, but Mrs. Williams had insisted he complete his usual duties. "Don't touch the handle with your bare hands," Mrs. Williams snapped, pulling her designer bag close as if to protect it from contamination. "Use a cloth. I don't want smudges." Behind her, Mr. Williams emerged from his Range Rover, barking orders into his Bluetooth earpiece about foreclosing on another family's home. Sarah's stomach churned as she remembered the morning's events. An elderly woman, her weathered hands clutching a basket of fresh vegetables grown in her small garden, had come to the service entrance. The produce was already modestly priced, but Mrs. Williams had spent 20 minutes berating the woman about the cost, eventually paying less than half the asking price. "These people need to learn business," her mother had declared over lunch at Le Chateau, where she casually ordered a $200 bottle of wine. "If they want to play in our world, they need to understand how things work." The restaurant owner, a well-known socialite, had hovered nearby, and Mrs. Williams had insisted on leaving an extravagant tip, making sure others noticed her generosity. David's cough echoed through the hallway as he carried in shopping bags from the luxury boutiques. His face was flushed with fever, but He maintained his careful movements, protecting the expensive items. Sarah had secretly left medicine and water in his quarters that morning, but her mother had kept him running errands all day without rest. "The garden needs weeding before dinner," Mr. Williams called out, not bothering to look up from his phone. "And the patio furniture needs cleaning. The Blackwells are coming over tonight." "Yes, sir," David responded quietly, his voice hoarse. He headed toward the garden, pausing only briefly to steady himself against a wall when he thought no one was looking. But Sarah saw. She always saw. Through the kitchen window, Sarah watched him work methodically in the garden, stopping occasionally to wipe sweat from his brow. Despite his illness, he still took a moment to leave water for the stray cats that frequented the property. His lips moved in what she recognized as prayer as he worked, finding strength in his faith even as his body weakened. The contrast was stark that evening as the Blackwells arrived in their luxury cars. The table was set with crystal and silver, David serving silently despite his deteriorating condition. The conversation flowed freely about offshore accounts and property acquisitions, punctuated by laughter about those people who couldn't pay their mortgages. "We had to evict another family today," Mr. Williams boasted, swirling his expensive cognac. "They tried to plead about medical bills, but business is business." The Blackwells nodded in agreement, complimenting the Williams' business acumen. From her seat at the table, Sarah noticed David's hands trembling as he poured water, his face pale in the chandelier light. When a drop of water splashed onto the tablecloth, Mrs. Williams' eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'll have that laundered tonight," she commanded, "and the entire dining room needs to be spotless before you sleep." "Mother, he's sick," Sarah finally spoke up, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation. "He needs rest." "He needs to earn his keep," Mr. Williams responded dismissively. "We're not running a charity here. If he can't handle the work, we can easily replace him." Later that night, as the guests departed and her parents retired to their wing of the house, Sarah found David struggling to polish the silver, his fever clearly worse. Their eyes met in the dim kitchen light, and in that moment something shifted in Sarah's world. The massive house, the expensive cars, the offshore accounts. It all felt hollow compared to the quiet dignity of the man before her, who maintained his humanity despite every attempt to diminish it. Thunder rolled in the distance as Sarah helped David back to his quarters, defying her parents' strict rules about interaction with the staff. As rain began to fall on the immaculate grounds of the Williams estate, two hearts began to recognize a truth that would soon shake the foundations of their separate worlds. In the garden shed that served as David's home, a small cross hung on the wall beside his neatly made bed. On his simple desk lay a notebook open to a page filled with calculations, not for himself, but for how to help the gardener's children afford school supplies. Even in his fevered state, his thoughts were for others. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the mansion where wealth dwelt uneasily with conscience, and against the humble shed where faith endured despite hardship. The storm was just beginning, in more ways than one. The morning after David's fever broke, Sarah found him at his usual post before dawn, kneeling in prayer among the roses. His voice, still hoarse, carried softly in the morning mist. "Thank you for strength in trials, for beauty in small things." He didn't notice her presence, and she remained silent, something stirring in her heart at this glimpse of raw gratitude. Recovery had left David weaker, but his spirit seemed stronger. Sarah began finding ways to lighten his load without drawing attention, a glass of water appearing by his side while he cleaned. Complex tasks mysteriously completed before he could get to them. Small gestures that spoke volumes in their silence. Their first real conversation happened in the library. Sarah discovered David there late one night, carefully cleaning the shelves, but pausing occasionally to trace the spines of books with reverent fingers. "You like reading?" she asked, making him jump. Recovery had left David weaker, but his spirit seemed stronger. Sarah began finding ways to lighten his load without drawing attention, a glass of water appearing by his side while he cleaned. Complex tasks mysteriously completed before he could get to them. Small gestures that spoke volumes in their silence. Their first real conversation happened in the library. Sarah discovered David there late one night, carefully cleaning the shelves, but pausing occasionally to trace the spines of books with reverent fingers. "You like reading?" she asked, making him jump. "Miss Williams, I'm sorry, I was just—" "Please, it's Sarah." She pulled a volume from the shelf. "Do you know this one?" It was Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. David's eyes lit up, temporarily forgetting his station. "The story of the Jodes," he said. "I wrote my thesis on Steinbeck's portrayal of economic inequality." Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face because he immediately stiffened, remembering his place. But she pressed on. "Your thesis? You have a degree?" Over the next hour, they talked about literature, social justice, and dreams. David had graduated top of his class in business administration, but his family's medical debts had derailed his plans for an MBA. Sarah shared her own struggles with privilege, her social work degree, and her growing discomfort with her parents' world. Their midnight conversations became a quiet ritual. David would share stories about teaching the gardener's children to read, his voice animated as he described their progress. Sarah would bring books from her collection, and they would discuss them in whispered tones in the kitchen after her parents had retired. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found David in the garage, carefully repairing a bicycle. "It's for Miguel's daughter," he explained, referring to the groundskeeper's child. "Her birthday's coming up." "Let me help," Sarah said, picking up a wrench. David began to protest, but she cut him off. "I need to learn how to fix things myself." As they worked, David taught her about more than just bicycle repair. He spoke of his parents. His father, a carpenter who believed in crafting beauty even in simple things. His mother, a teacher who gave free lessons to neighborhood children until cancer took her. Their medical bills had consumed the family's savings, leading David to put aside his dreams to pay off their debts. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found David in the garage, carefully repairing a bicycle. "It's for Miguel's daughter," he explained, referring to the groundskeeper's child. "Her birthday's coming up." "Let me help," Sarah said, picking up a wrench. David began to protest, but she cut him off. "I need to learn how to fix things myself." As they worked, David taught her about more than just bicycle repair. He spoke of his parents. His father, a carpenter who believed in crafting beauty even in simple things. His mother, a teacher who gave free lessons to neighborhood children until cancer took her. Their medical bills had consumed the family's savings, leading David to put aside his dreams to pay off their debts. The bicycle became their project, a symbol of their growing connection. Sarah learned to get her hands dirty, to find satisfaction in practical work. David began sharing more of himself, his business ideas, his hopes of starting a foundation for underprivileged students, his faith that gave him strength through hardship. Their worlds merged in small ways. Sarah started joining David for dawn prayers, though she stood awkwardly at first, unsure of the words. He began helping her with her charity work, offering insights from his business education that made her outreach more effective. The gardener's children became their secret joy. Together, they turned David's reading lessons into full tutoring sessions. Sarah brought materials from her teaching internship, while David applied his business knowledge to make learning practical and engaging. In those moments, social barriers dissolved, replaced by shared purpose. But paradise had thorns. Each evening, Sarah watched her parents treat David with calculated cruelty, each insult making her heart ache more. She saw how he absorbed their scorn with dignity, but also noticed the toll it took, the tightening around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands after particularly harsh encounters. One evening, after Mrs. Williams had berated David for using the wrong polish on the silver, Sarah found him in the garden. He wasn't praying this time, just sitting quietly, staring at the stars. Without a word, she sat beside him on the worn bench. "How do you bear it?" she whispered. David was quiet for a long moment. "My father used to say that character is built in valleys, not on mountaintops." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "But sometimes, even in valleys, you find unexpected flowers growing." The night air carried the scent of roses and possibility. Their hands lay inches apart on the bench, not touching, but both acutely aware of the diminishing space between their worlds. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing the first trembling moments of a love that would soon challenge everything they knew. In the distance, a security light flickered on, reminding them of boundaries still to be crossed, battles still to be fought. But in that moment, on a simple garden bench, two souls recognized each other beyond the artificial barriers of class and status, planting seeds of change that would grow stronger than they could imagine. The silver necklace lay on Mrs. Williams's vanity table, its diamonds catching morning light. By evening, the house erupted in chaos. "Thief!" Mrs. Williams's voice echoed through the mansion. "That filthy thief!" She stood in the master bedroom, pointing a manicured finger at David, who stood quietly, hands clasped before him. The missing necklace had appeared in his quarters during routine staff inspection. Sarah watched from the doorway as her father's face darkened with manufactured rage. "I knew we couldn't trust these people," he spat. "Call the police, dear." But something didn't add up. Sarah had seen that necklace just yesterday when her mother wore it to lunch. More importantly, she'd noticed her mother's strange behavior that morning. The furtive glances, the unusual insistence that security check David's quarters specifically. While her parents continued their theatrical outrage, Sarah slipped away to her father's study. Her hands trembled as she accessed the security system on his computer, a password she'd discovered months ago during her growing suspicion of her parents' business practices. The footage revealed everything. Mrs. Williams entering David's quarters early that morning, the necklace clutched in her hand. The deliberate placement, the careful rearrangement of his few possessions to suggest a hasty hiding place. Her mother's motivation became clear. She'd seen the growing connection between Sarah and David. This was no random accusation. It was a calculated attack. Sarah's mind raced to the documents she'd discovered last week. Tax fraud, worker exploitation, illegal property acquisitions. Her father's empire built on quicksand of deceit. One anonymous tip would bring everything crashing down. She found her voice. "Stop!" The word cut through the chaos. Sarah connected her phone to the study's large screen, security footage playing in damning clarity. "Would you like to explain this, Mother?" The color drained from Mrs. Williams' face. Mr. Williams stepped forward, threat in his stance. "Sarah, you're not thinking clearly." "No, Father. For the first time, I'm seeing everything clearly." She held up her phone. "Including the offshore accounts, the forged documents, the creative accounting. One email to the authorities." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Her father's face contorted with rage and fear. "You wouldn't dare! Try me! Fire David with false accusations and everything goes public." Her voice remained steady despite her pounding heart. "Your reputation, your social standing, your empire, gone." Silence filled the room. David stood watching, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. This was not the privileged daughter they thought they knew. "You're willing to destroy your family for a servant?" Mrs. Williams whispered. "I'm willing to fight for justice. Something you taught me about in all those charity galas, remember? Or was that just for show, too?" The standoff lasted minutes that felt like hours. Finally, Mr. Williams spoke, his voice cold. "The boy keeps his job, but this isn't over." That night, in the garden where their friendship had first blossomed, David found Sarah sitting alone. "You shouldn't have risked everything for me," he said softly. Sarah looked up at the stars. "I didn't just do it for you. I did it because it was right." She turned to him. "They needed to learn they can't break everyone they think is beneath them." David touched her hand gently, a first breach of propriety that sent electricity through them both. "Your courage, it's not what they think it is it? Not privilege or rebellion, it's something deeper." "Like your faith," she whispered. "Some things are worth fighting for." Above them, security cameras blinked red in the darkness. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. Sarah's parents might have retreated, but wounded vipers are the most dangerous. As David's hand found hers in the darkness, they both knew this was just the beginning of their test. In the master bedroom, Mrs. Williams watched the garden footage on her tablet, her face hard with resolve. "We need to separate them," she told her husband. "Whatever it takes." The necklace lay forgotten on the vanity, its diamonds now dull under artificial light, much like the facade of perfection in the Williams household that was slowly beginning to crack. Dawn painted the garden in gentle hues as Sarah made her way to their meeting spot. David already knelt in prayer by the rose bushes, his whispered devotions carrying on the morning breeze. Without a word, she knelt beside him, their shoulders barely touching. Their morning rituals had evolved since the necklace incident. Prayer became their sanctuary, a time when social barriers dissolved in shared contemplation. David taught her the prayers his mother had passed down, while Sarah shared readings from her social work studies about community healing. The local orphanage became their shared mission. Every Thursday, when Sarah supposedly attended her book club, they would spend hours with the children. David's business knowledge transformed the orphanage's struggling finances, while Sarah's social work training helped address deeper emotional needs. Together, they created programs that went beyond basic care, teaching life skills, offering tutoring, building hope. One stormy morning, they huddled beneath the old oak tree near the orphanage, watching children splash in puddles during a break in their lessons. "They remind me of who I was," David said softly. "After my parents died, before the debts crushed everything, there was still joy in simple things." Sarah watched a young girl twirl in the rain. "We could do more," she whispered. "Start a foundation. Create real change." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. Together. Their first kiss wasn't planned. They were sorting donations in the orphanage's storage room, discussing plans for a vocational training program. David explained his vision with such passion that Sarah found herself moving closer, drawn by the light in his eyes. When their lips met, it felt like coming home. But paradise had watchful eyes. Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor who benefited from David's kindness, warned them one evening about Mrs. Williams' suspicious questions. The house staff walked on eggshells, feeling the tension building. They grew more careful, but not less determined. Notes hidden in library books became their love letters. Dawn prayers turned into whispered dreams of future plans. David shared his business proposals for sustainable community development. Sarah contributed her research on social program implementation. After particularly harsh days, when her parents' cruelty targeted David more directly, they would meet in the garden shed late at night. Sometimes they just sat in silence, her head on his shoulder, his faith providing strength for them both. Other times, they planned their future foundation, sketching organizational charts and program outlines by flashlight. One night, during a power outage that left the mansion dark, they dared to dance in the moonlit garden. David hummed an old hymn his mother used to sing, while Sarah swayed in his arms, both acutely aware of the security cameras rendered temporarily blind. "If they catch us," Sarah whispered against his chest. "They'll see what true wealth looks like," David finished. "Love that doesn't count the cost." But cost was coming. Neither saw the garden maintenance worker watching from the shadows, hurrying to the main house with news that would shatter their secret world. The next morning dawned blood red, a harbinger of storms to come. As David led their morning prayer, Sarah noticed movement behind the library curtains. Her mother's silhouette, watching, plotting. Their last moment of peace found them sharing dreams beneath the rose arbor. "When we build our foundation," Sarah said, "these roses will bloom in the courtyard. Everyone who comes for help will see beauty first." David squeezed her hand. Beauty and thorns, like love. Hours later, their world would explode. But in that moment, surrounded by roses and dawn light, two hearts beat as one, a rhythm that would need to sustain them through the trials ahead. In the mansion, Mrs. Williams ended a phone call with her private investigator, a cold smile playing on her lips. The storm was about to break. The evening started like any other at the Williams estate. Crystal glasses clinked in the dining room as the family entertained important clients. David moved silently between tables, refilling water glasses, invisible to most guests. But tonight, Mrs. Williams watched his every move with predatory attention. The trap was set during dessert. Mrs. Williams deliberately dropped her napkin near Sarah's chair. "David, dear," she called sweetly, her voice dripping with feigned kindness that made Sarah's spine stiffen. "Would you get that?" As David bent to retrieve the napkin, Mrs. Williams stood suddenly, bumping into him. His hand instinctively reached out to steady himself, catching Sarah's shoulder. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, one touch, one look, but it was enough. "How dare you touch my daughter?" Mrs. Williams' voice shattered the elegant atmosphere. The room froze. "First the necklace, and now this?" Mr. Williams rose from his chair, face darkening. But before he could speak, the garden maintenance worker stepped forward from his position by the door. "Sir, ma'am, there's more. I've seen them together in the garden at dawn, praying together. And at night." Sarah's world collapsed as the worker revealed their secret meetings, their whispered conversations, their shared dreams. Each word was a nail in the coffin of their carefully hidden love. "Enough!" Mr. Williams roared. The business associates watched with fascinated horror as he advanced on David. "You dare seduce my daughter after we gave you a job, a place to stay? Father, stop!" Sarah stood, but her mother's manicured fingers dug into her arm, holding her back. "Call the police," Mr. Williams commanded. "We'll add harassment charges to the theft accusations." "No!" Sarah broke free. "I'll tell them everything. About the tax fraud, the illegal properties, all of it." The room went deadly quiet. Business associates exchanged worried glances. Mr. Williams's face contorted with rage and fear. "Take her to her room," he ordered the security guard. "And you," he turned to David, "you have 5 minutes to get your things and get out. If you're ever seen near this house or my daughter again, I'll destroy you so thoroughly you'll wish you'd never been born." As security dragged her away, Sarah caught one last glimpse of David. He stood tall, dignity intact despite the humiliation. Their eyes met across the chaos. A lifetime of love and dreams condensed into one final look. "Beloved Sarah, remember what we read in the garden? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Our love is both, hope and evidence. Whatever comes, know that every dawn prayer will carry your name. Every sunset will remember our dreams. The foundation we planned will be built, if not by our hands, then by our legacy. Keep faith, dear heart. Love finds its way through harder trials than this. Until God wills our paths to cross again, David." Sarah pressed the letter to her heart, hearing the sound of her mother's heels approaching down the hallway. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered, reflecting the darkness about to descend on her world. But in her heart, a fire had been lit that no amount of wealth or threats could extinguish. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not the privileged daughter of the Williams family, but a warrior, ready for battle. They thought separating them would end this love story. They had no idea it was just beginning. In the security office, Mrs. Williams watched the footage of David walking away one last time, a satisfied smile on her face. She didn't notice her daughter's expression in the window, the same expression that had crossed the face of revolutionaries and martyrs throughout history. The look of someone who had found something worth sacrificing everything for. The storm broke over the Williams estate, rain washing away David's footprints from the driveway. But no force of nature could erase the imprint he'd left on their lives, or the changes he'd set in motion in Sarah's heart. The morning after David's departure, Sarah emerged from her room transformed. Gone was the designer dress, replaced by the simplest clothes she owned. Her mother nearly choked on her morning coffee at the sight. "This ridiculous rebellion ends now," Mrs. Williams declared, waving an invitation. "The Blackwell's son is hosting a charity gala. You'll attend, dressed appropriately, and begin behaving like a Williams." Sarah met her mother's gaze steadily. "No." "No?" Her father looked up from his newspaper. "You don't have a choice." "I always have a choice," Sarah replied, placing her credit cards and car keys on the table. just like I'm choosing to leave." Her parents' laughter died when she shouldered a backpack containing only essentials. "You won't survive a day without our money," her mother scoffed. "I'd rather starve with dignity than feast on cruelty." Sarah's voice carried the strength of her conviction. "David taught me that." She walked out of the mansion with nothing but her education, some clothes, and the letter hidden next to her heart. Her first stop, the tiny apartment of Maria, the cleaning lady they'd fired last year for being too familiar with the family. Maria took her in without question, sharing her cramped one-bedroom apartment. Sarah slept on a worn couch, learning for the first time what it meant to count pennies and stretch meals. During the day, she worked as a substitute teacher, while evenings were spent tutoring students from low-income families. Her parents' attempts to bring her home ranged from threats to bribes. Each week brought a new suitor from their social circle, bearing promises of luxury and status. Sarah turned them all away. Instead, she built a new life from scratch. Her social work degree proved invaluable at the community center where she volunteered. She started a literacy program, remembering how David had taught the gardener's children. Her students were rough around the edges, but their hunger for knowledge reminded her of dawn prayers in the garden. 3 months into her self-imposed exile, the first test of her resolve came. Her mother arrived at the community center, designer heels clicking on worn linoleum. "Your trust fund," Mrs. Williams offered, placing a check on the desk. "All of it. Come home, forget this foolishness about the boy." Sarah looked at the check, enough money to fund the community center for years. Then she thought of David's quiet dignity in the face of her parents' cruelty. "Keep it," she said softly. "Some things aren't for sale." Her mother's face hardened. "He's probably forgotten you already, found some other rich girl to con." But Sarah had seen something her mother hadn't, the local newspaper article about free carpentry classes being offered in a neighboring town, teaching job skills to underprivileged youth. She recognized David's vision in the program structure. He was building their dream, piece by piece, just as she was. Months passed. Sarah's hands grew calloused from real work. She learned to cook from Maria, to budget from necessity, to find joy in simple victories. A student learning to read, a family finding housing, a teenager choosing education over gangs. One evening, exhausted from a long day of teaching, Sarah found an eviction notice on Maria's door. That night, she cried for the first time since leaving home, not from despair, but from understanding, finally comprehending the fear that lived in the hearts of those her father carelessly evicted. The next morning, she started a tenants' rights organization. Her parents sent private investigators who reported back on their daughter's descent into common life. They couldn't understand why she smiled more now, living in poverty, than she ever had in their mansion. On Sundays, she attended the small church where David used to pray. She never saw him there, but something of his spirit lingered in the humble congregation that welcomed her without questioning her background. 6 months after walking out, Sarah received an invitation to her father's annual business gala. Scrawled at the bottom was a note, "We miss you. Please come home." She turned the invitation over, writing her response on the back, "I am home. When you're ready to see the real world, come visit me here." That night, in her tiny shared apartment, Sarah unfolded David's letter, its creases worn from frequent reading. "Faith is the substance of things hoped for," she whispered to herself, adding a silent prayer of her own. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere out there, David was building their dream from his end. Someday, their paths would cross again. Until then, she had work to do. In the morning, she would start writing grant proposals for her community programs. The foundation they'd dreamed of might not bear the Williams name, but it would carry their shared vision. A world where worth was measured by character, not currency. Her mother was right about one thing. She wasn't a Williams anymore. She was becoming something far stronger. Lightning split the sky over the Williams estate, followed by an explosion that turned night into day. Fire consumed the east wing of the mansion, where Mr. Williams kept his offices, decades of business records feeding the flames. The electrical fire, sparked by aging wiring, spread with terrifying speed. Sarah learned about it from the morning news while preparing for her classes. The headline stopped her heart. Williams Enterprise headquarters destroyed in overnight blaze. Her first instinct was to run home, but pride held her back. Then her phone rang. Maria, still connected to the house staff network. "Your mother." Maria's voice shook. "She's not taking it well. Your father, he's different. The insurance won't cover everything because of some problem with the papers. They're saying fraud." The universe, it seemed, had its own sense of justice. Across town, in the workshop where he'd built a new life, David watched the same news. His hands stilled on the chair he was crafting as images of the burning mansion filled the screen. Without a word to his confused colleagues, he began making calls. The Williams' former staff, the gardener, the maids, the cook, all those who had suffered the family's cruelty, received messages through the community grapevine. A meeting was called at the local church. Sarah arrived at the church that evening, drawn by rumors of community action. She stopped in the doorway, heart pounding. There stood David, older, stronger, his simple work clothes bearing the marks of honest labor. He was addressing a room full of familiar faces. Former staff members, local business owners, community leaders. "They need our help," he was saying. "Not because they deserve it, but because it's right. We show true character not by returning cruelty for cruelty, but by offering grace to those who showed us none." Their eyes met across the room. Time stopped, then rushed forward. The next days saw an extraordinary mobilization. David's carpentry students helped salvage what they could from the mansion. Sarah's community center opened its doors to house displaced staff members. Former employees returned to help, not out of obligation but following David and Sarah's example of forgiveness. Mr. Williams, stripped of his artificial power, watched in bewilderment as people he'd treated as beneath him worked tirelessly to save what they could of his life's work. His wife, her designer clothes smoke-stained, sat in the community center drinking coffee from a chipped mug, served by a woman she'd once fired. David and Sarah worked separately but in harmony, their old dreams taking new shape in crisis. She organized temporary housing and support services. He coordinated reconstruction efforts, applying his business knowledge to create order from chaos. They finally spoke alone in the burned garden, where their love had first blossomed. The roses had survived the fire, their resilience a testament to unseen strength. "You built something beautiful," David said softly, gesturing at her community programs. "So did you," she replied, thinking of his carpentry school and youth programs. The air between them hummed with unspoken words, with growth and change and love that had matured through separation. They were no longer the same people who had prayed together at dawn. They were stronger, tested, proven. Mr. Williams found them there, his face aged years in days. He looked at their clasped hands, then at the community gathered on his lawn, rich and poor, former staff and current volunteers, all working together. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "After everything, why help us?" David's answer was simple. "Because every soul has worth, sir, even those who forgot their own." Sarah watched realization dawn in her father's eyes. The fire had burned away more than wealth. It had consumed the illusions that had blinded him for so long. As the sun set over the changed landscape of the Williams estate, David led them all in prayer. Former masters and servants, rich and poor, united in human dignity. Sarah's hand found his, their fingers intertwining like roots, growing deeper than status or wealth could reach. The divine intervention hadn't just been the fire. It was the revelation that true wealth lay in the community they'd built, the love they'd never abandoned, and the faith that had guided them home to each other. The bankruptcy court was cold and impersonal. Mr. Williams sat slumped in his chair as the judge read through the findings. Insurance had rejected their claim due to undisclosed business practices. Creditors circled like vultures. The Williams empire was crumbling. "There might be a way," David spoke quietly from beside Sarah. They'd spent nights analyzing the business records that survived the fire. "But it requires complete transparency and a total restructuring." Mr. Williams laughed bitterly. "And why would you help? Looking for revenge?" "No, sir." David met his eyes steadily. "Looking for redemption. Yours." The plan they presented was radical. Convert the remaining Williams properties into affordable housing. Transform the rebuilt mansion's east wing into a community center. Create a worker-owned cooperative from the surviving businesses. Most shocking of all, David would use his business degree to help restructure everything, with Sarah's social work expertise ensuring community needs were met. "You'll lose your social status," Sarah warned her parents, "but you'll gain something better. Purpose." Mrs. Williams, who hadn't spoken much since the fire, suddenly straightened. "Like what you found?" she asked her daughter, really seeing her for the first time. The transformation wasn't smooth. Mr. Williams struggled to treat former employees as equals. Mrs. Williams had to learn the value of work not measured in dollars. But slowly, change came. The first victory was small, Mr. Williams defending a janitor against a rude client. Then larger ones followed. Mrs. Williams started teaching etiquette classes at Sarah's community center, her expertise finally serving a purpose beyond social climbing. David's carpentry school expanded, taking over one of the Williams' empty warehouses. Former luxury apartments were converted into affordable housing with workspaces for small businesses. Sarah's social programs flourished, now properly funded through the restructured Williams Enterprises. The turning point came during a community council meeting. A former maid challenged Mr. Williams on a housing policy. Instead of erupting in anger, he listened, then changed his stance. "You know the residents' needs better than I do," he admitted. That evening, he found David in the workshop, carefully crafting a table for the new community center. "I never asked," Mr. Williams said quietly, "about my daughter's ring." David looked up. "I've been saving to buy one." "No," Mr. Williams shook his head. "My mother's ring. Sarah should have it. If you'll both have my blessing." The next day, Mrs. Williams appeared at Sarah's office, eyes red. "I found this." She held out a photo album. "Pictures of you and David from the security cameras. I'd collected them to use against you, but now..." She touched a photo of them praying in the garden. "I see what I couldn't before. Love isn't about status." The Williams' social circle was scandalized by their descent into community work. Former friends dropped them. Country club memberships were quietly canceled. But new relationships formed. Real ones, based on mutual respect and shared purpose. David and Sarah's work caught media attention. "Revolutionary Community Development Model," the headlines read, highlighting how their approach combined business acumen with social responsibility. Delegations from other cities came to study their programs. Mr. Williams, who once measured worth in dollars, now spent hours mentoring small business owners. Mrs. Williams, who had collected designer labels, started a professional clothing donation program for job seekers. 1 year after the fire, the rebuilt East Wing opened as the Williams-Chen Community Center. At the ceremony, Mr. Williams surprised everyone by asking David to speak first. "A wise man once told me, 'Character is built in valleys, not on mountaintops,'" David began. "But sometimes the valley itself becomes a mountain, transformed by love, work, and grace." Sarah watched her father wipe away tears as David continued. Her mother clutched her hand, both women remembering darker days with gratitude for the light that had followed. The Williams name now stood for something new. Not power over others, but power shared for the common good. The redemption arc was complete, not despite their fall from high society, but because of it. That evening, in the garden where it all began, David finally knelt before Sarah, offering not just a ring, but a continuation of their shared mission. Her parents watched from a respectful distance, finally understanding that true legacy isn't built on wealth, but on love that transforms. 5 years after the fire that changed everything, the Williams-Chen Foundation headquarters buzzed with activity. What had started in a burned garden had blossomed into something extraordinary. The wedding had been simple but meaningful. Instead of an extravagant reception, they'd used the budget to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students. Their guests had been a beautiful mixture: corporate executives sitting beside former housekeepers, community leaders alongside reformed ex-convicts from their rehabilitation program. Now, on their 5th anniversary, David and Sarah stood in their office, surrounded by photographs telling their story. The old mansion, transformed into a community hub, housed their expanding operations. The garden where they'd once prayed in secret now served as a teaching space for urban agriculture programs. Remember when we dreamed about this? Sarah touched a picture of their first graduating class. Former street kids now employed as skilled craftsmen from David's vocational school. The reality is better than the dream, David smiled, adjusting their 2-year-old daughter Elena in his arms. She had her mother's determination and her father's gentle eyes. Their foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. David's business acumen combined with Sarah's social work expertise created programs that didn't just help people. They transformed communities. They'd developed a model that other cities were now adapting, combining affordable housing, job training, education, and small business support. Mr. Williams, once obsessed with social status, now spent his days mentoring young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. His business knowledge, once used for personal gain, became a tool for empowerment. Mrs. Williams ran a successful program helping domestic workers start their own cleaning companies, teaching them the business skills she'd once used to exploit them. The annual foundation gala reflected their values. Instead of crystal and caviar, local catering businesses showcased their skills. Entertainment came from community arts programs they'd funded. Success stories weren't measured in dollars, but in lives changed. Maria, who'd once taken Sarah in during her darkest days, now directed their housing program. The gardener's children, whom David had tutored in secret, were university graduates working in community development. Their love story became legend in the community, but not for its romance. It was the story of how love could transform not just 2 people, but an entire society. Young couples would come to their marriage preparation program, learning that true partnership meant shared purpose, not shared privilege. One evening, they found Mr. and Mrs. Williams in the garden, playing with Elena. The elder Williams had aged gracefully, their faces lined with laugh lines instead of worry. "I was just telling Elena about the roses," Mrs. Williams said softly. "How they survived the fire and bloomed stronger. Like love," Mr. Williams added, his voice thick with emotion. "Like family." The foundation's latest initiative was their most ambitious yet, a nationwide network of community development centers based on their model. They called it Project Dawn, remembering those early morning prayers that had started everything. Their story appeared in social work textbooks and business schools alike, teaching future generations that profit and purpose could coexist. But more importantly, it lived in the hearts of thousands whose lives they'd touched. On quiet mornings, David and Sarah still prayed in the garden, now with Elena between them. The roses bloomed around them, their fragrance mingling with the sounds of a community awakening to possibility. "Mama," Elena asked one morning, "why do you and Papa help so many people?" Sarah exchanged glances with David before answering, "Because love isn't love until you give it away." The Williams-Chen Foundation's motto, carved above their entrance, read, "Faith sees the invisible, believes the incredible, receives the impossible." Below it, a simple rose bloomed in stone, reminding all who entered that beauty could grow in the most unlikely places. As the sun rose over their transformed world, David and Sarah held hands, watching their daughter play among the roses. Their legacy wasn't in buildings or programs, but in the ripples of love that would continue long after they were gone, a testament to the power of 2 hearts that dared to believe in something greater than status or wealth. In the end, their greatest achievement wasn't that they had built a foundation, but that they had laid the foundation for countless others to build their own dreams. Their love story hadn't just changed their lives, It had changed the very definition of success in their community. And somewhere, in a garden where it all began, roses still bloomed, witnessing the eternal truth that love, when planted in faith and watered with purpose, could transform the world. Because, as David and Sarah showed us, sometimes the greatest revolutions start with a simple act of kindness, a moment of courage, or a prayer. If this story has touched you, take action. Share it with someone who needs encouragement to stand up for what's right. Look for opportunities to bridge social divides in your own community. Support local organizations working for social justice and community development. Most importantly, start seeing people for their character, not their status. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of transformation. And remember, love isn't love until you give it away. Until next time, keep faith, stay courageous, and let your love change the world.